Hello, Chapter 5, Week 5, recapping my unexpected autism and ADHD here. In last week's video, available up here, I talked about the pros and cons of getting a formal diagnosis once you've self-diagnosed as autistic. I'll talk a little bit more this week about my personal journey and how hard it can be to actually get help when you need it. But the main focus of this week's episode is going to be autism burnout. What it is, what it looks like, what it feels like. You may have experienced this multiple times and possibly not even realised it was autism burnout. Let me start by setting the scene of what was going on with me about a month after my initial light bulb went off that I was probably neurodivergent, and then I'll get into some broader generalities around autistic burnout and some of the signs to look out for. So we're mid-January 2022. I was back in London from spending the Christmas break up in Scotland, drowning at work again. On top of work being really busy, I was also really distracted, couldn't concentrate. My coping and organising strategies and mechanisms weren't working anymore. Since being in the civil service, I've always arranged and organised all my work into folders and subfolders, which I review regularly. But the job I was doing at the time, I'd never had to be across such a wide breadth of work. I counted them up and had 534 folders and subfolders for the job I was doing and just couldn't cope and stay on top of it anymore. I think I was already at capacity, having to pedal so hard just to keep up and approaching another burnout already. This wasn't my first burnout, but I didn't know they'd been autistic burnouts previously. Self-diagnosing as autistic over Christmas 21 was basically too much to deal with on top of everything else and tipped me over the edge into a full burnout. This might be going a bit niche interest, but I love Formula One motor racing. It's a big hobby of mine. There was a legendary F1 driver, Ayrton Senna, who at the 1988 Monaco Grand Prix was in the lead of the race by almost a minute, going faster and faster and setting lap record after lap record. There was no need for him to be going this fast, and he later described it as almost being in a trance, operating beyond his own limits. His team eventually got on the radio and told him to slow down, and he almost immediately crashed into a wall and went out of the race. My self-diagnosis and going down the autism Google rabbit hole was basically my team radio call telling me to slow down. I'd been pushing myself like crazy for over a decade, trying to prove to myself and others that I was really good at work, really capable, really smart. Ain't no problem with me, look at me nailing it. No one can guess I'm drowning if I'm smashing it, right? I was in a trance going faster and faster, and I got a radio call and I hit the wall hard. The problem was I'd hit a wall internally, and because I'd always gone to great lengths to hide that in the past, I didn't really know how to communicate that or how to get help now. I tried to refer myself for an occupational health assessment at work to see if I could get any autism adjustments at work without, or at least in advance of, a formal diagnosis. But that was a dead end. I was told by our employee assistants that only a manager can refer an employee for an OH review. An individual employee can't self-refer themselves. That's utter BS and needs to change. An employee should be able to get mental health assistance in a big organisation that claims to offer it without alerting your manager. And B, work had basically said, no, can't help, you need to look elsewhere. So I called my GP next and said I was really struggling with my mental health, but no appointments were available. They said a doctor may call me that Friday. I waited in all day for a call. It didn't come. I chased. The GP admin said it had been too busy and someone would call me the following Tuesday. But the problem was I was spiraling and needed help now. I'd never really needed, or at least never acknowledged that I'd needed help like this before, but help was just not there when I needed it. Having self-diagnosed, I was almost having like an identity crisis and suddenly felt like some kind of fake person who'd just been noticed and had a huge spotlight shone down on me from the heavens, like, you've been rumbled, son, we've found you out. So next, I self referred myself to my local authority autism services after finding them via Google, who told me they'd begin an assessment process that would take around 9 months. I think I just felt really gaslit by everyone. I felt like I was having a bit of a mental health crisis now, not in 9 months' time. So, next, I think I just took things into my own hands a bit. I backed out of and cancelled all my work meetings. I felt like my mental health walls were closing in, and just tried to shut all the noise out. So I just cancelled everything and did my hobby lists. I played solitaire on my laptop. I felt like the ice was kind of cracking under me, under my feet a little bit. So after a day of that paralysis, I reached out to a private assessment clinic. It was stupidly expensive, but they listened to me and sympathised and could do an autism assessment for me in a matter of weeks, not months. Work support and NHS support were nowhere, and I think I felt like I had to spend money to keep my wheels from falling off a really thin road. So I booked a private appointment and I called in sick to work. The realization I'd likely been autistic all this time was my team radio message, and all the other spinning plates I'd had kind of fell crashing to the floor at once. And the next thing I did was basically to run away. I Googled Airbnbs in the countryside, a reasonable drive away from London, and found an Airbnb near Ashdown Forest, where it turned out the Winnie the Pooh 100-acre wood was, which was amazing. I went there for almost a week, again spending completely unnecessary amounts of money, but I just needed to be somewhere away from it all. And that's a privilege many people in a similar position to me don't have. I'm painfully aware of that. I ran away from my environment and I was able to walk through the actual 100-acre wood. So the Pooh Sticks Bridge, Eeyore stick houses, Owl House, the Heffalump tree were all there. They'd all been constructed. It was exactly the right place for me at the right time. I did the big walk up over Eeyore's gloomy place, which was really drizzly and misty and completely deserted when I walked there in the dead of winter, and it just felt perfect at that point because it felt like my soft toy stuffing was coming out a bit. Finding this place when I was at such a low ebb felt incredibly synchronistic and just right in some way. It gave me confidence that things were going to eventually fall back into place in a slightly different order, maybe, but fall back into a better order than they had been before, having found this out about myself. I think there's something to listening to your inner GPS, call it spider sense, call it gut instinct, but sometimes switching off the logical thinking part of your brain lets the feeling part that we often squash down take over and drive your car when it needs to. It's your autopilot, and I think that inner GPS fundamentally knows where to take you sometimes, and it'll often be away from the environment that's been damaging you, whether that's work or home or whatever. So this was my first autism burnout that I realized was an autism burnout. I later reflected and realized all the previous times I'd had autism burnouts that I'd tried to explain away as something else. Dropping out of my gap year, dropping out of university, going from job to job to job because each one became too much. But always making excuses to justify, never saying, I'm struggling, I need help. It's basically a shutdown and flight or freeze response from overwhelm, like a laptop going into safe mode. Mini burnouts from too much work or socializing can last hours. More severe ones can last days or weeks, and the latter happens when you try to, or feel obliged to, push through the former time after time after time and basically run out of resource. You don't have sufficient time or energy reserves to recover from everything that's been taken out of you, and you break. It's a primary reason why, unfortunately, rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide are much higher than the norm in autistic people. Signs of an impending autistic burnout are many, and they can include increasing lethargy, increasing irritability, increasing anxiety, noticeable changes in sensitivity to sensory information, either a big increase or a big decrease, a decrease in communication skills, both verbal and written, increased withdrawal, increased emotional dysregulation, brain fog, a slowing down of thought processes, forgetfulness or memory loss, a noticeable decrease in motivation, inability to generate momentum, increasingly rigid or narrow thinking, an increasing sense of overwhelm, feelings of guilt or shame, increased executive dysfunction and demand avoidance. The thing is, if you're not diagnosed as autistic, that all sounds and looks a lot like depression and can be and often is misdiagnosed, or worse, gets overlooked, minimized, or dismissed entirely, both by others and by yourself. Push through, you'll be fine. No, don't push through, you won't be fine. Take your alone time, take your decompression time, take recovery days off work if you need to. Don't just push through if you're on the verge of breaking. If you're on the verge of breaking and don't do anything different, you will break. And if you resonate with some of the stuff I've talked about in preceding videos, or if you've started doing your own research and self-diagnose, you'll start to see that it's not just depression. There might be something more going on under the surface. So I spent that week away from home and work trying to keep my wheels on the road, reading more and more about autism and trying to understand it, the spectrum, masking, coping strategies. I was recognizing almost all of it, and I was looking back on everything through a new lens, stuff from childhood that would probably be picked up today by teachers or healthcare people that is textbook autistic behavior, but was just quirky back then. Stuff like lining up all my toys in an excessively orderly way, hyper focus and obsessive attention on specific topics and hobbies, repetitive stress activities like hair pulling, pretending to be different fictional characters and acting like those characters for days on end. Data, the android from Star Trek, was my go-to character that I pretend to be. Difficulties relating to friends and interacting with other kids, hiding from other kids and finding spaces to be on my own at birthday parties. To paraphrase the fantastic autistic comedian Fern Brady, it's all just autism. So moving into adulthood, I was saying that I'd created a really complex series of masking and coping strategies refined over many years to get by unnoticed and even thrive in the neurotypical world, like stimming or hand flapping when anxious, pacing, full-on arguing with people in my head to avoid actual meltdowns, setting routines and tasks to do in a certain order to compensate against the unpredictability and confusion I felt from the world. I reached the conclusion that I'd managed really bloody well, I think, to mimic neurotypical behaviours over the years, but it had left me completely burnt out and exhausted. I'd had a number of these burnouts over the years, but this time, probably because I realised what it was for the first time, it really felt like I'd hit a hard wall. It can take me longer to process information and to plan and sequence certain activities, and it can take me longer to prepare for work meetings and even certain social situations due to a need to kind of practice what I want to do or say beforehand to make it more predictable and feel less stressful. So from the 100-acre wood, I called in sick to work and wasn't even sure at this point I could even go back to work at all. I just didn't really know what was happening to me and where it would end up, and genuinely thought about quitting work without any thought of what comes after that. The job I was doing at the time and the lack of resource to do it was not an ideal situation for someone with autism to not feel completely overwhelmed. And after this latest burnout, I was trying to read about adjustments and what was deemed reasonable, and realised if I did go back to work, I was going to need adjustments to be put in place to not drown anymore. But by the same token, looking back at what I had done and where I had got to, even though I was now starting to see just how much I'd masked and how much damage that had done me, I also realised how bloody well I'd done to cope with the jobs I'd had over the years, like working for politicians, working for the civil service. And as much as I was drowning, also felt really bloody proud of myself. But I definitely passed a watermark at this point, and it was the first time I'd had an autistic burnout. I knew it was an autistic burnout, and I knew things were going to have to be different moving forward because I couldn't keep going through these highs and crashes, basically. And I guess this is my central point this week. There will be a lot of undiagnosed autistic people out there who have suffered potentially multiple autistic burnouts over the years and done what I did and wrote them off as just tiredness or exhaustion or depression or not dealing as well as you could do with pressure or with emotional regulation. And it could be that. But ask yourself why other people might be able to deal with everyday neurotypical pressures and you can't. There's a chance it's all just autism, lads and lasses. And there's ways to cope and there's better days ahead. Ask me questions and comments below or via email at amineurodivergent@gmail.com if any of this resonates, or if there are things you'd like to hear me talk about here in future. I'd be happy to interact and respond. I might not be able to answer them immediately, but I'm happy to try, and I can always reflect on things and try to weave them in for future videos. Just to finish, I know this has already been longer than I usually do, to come back to my random car crash analogy, there were other races for Ayrton Senna after he crashed in Monaco. He got back in the car for the next race and won his first championship later that year. Yeah, I hope this was helpful. It was a bit long. Take care of yourselves, take space for yourselves, take time for yourselves if you need it, and see you next Sunday. Cheers.